Hey there, everyone. It's Sam here. This is lecture number 12 of the Introduction to Wiccan Theology. And this is basically the second part of the discussion of lore. Large amounts of this discussion were printed in my book, Creating Lore, Writing Ritual, which is available on Amazon for next to nothing. So again, we need our religion and the movement which expresses it to produce answers and practices that help individuals, families, and communities to cope with difficult times and create meaning in their lives so that they can be more effective in accomplishing their goals. Religion is a project of groups of people, not just a matter of individual inspiration. Individual inspiration is vitally important as energy, but things like trance and drawing down give us energy to create meaning with, but they don't have meaning in and of themselves. The traditional lore and customary practices of a group are not the creation or property of any individual, even if individuals originally wrote songs or rituals and made up stories. And I don't mean to abrogate intellectual property and copyright in this discussion. It's when a group of people takes up these things and uses them and develops and elaborates them that they become meaningful as lore rather than as art. A lovely poem can be a work of praise to the Great Mother, but if it is not used in ritual or teaching, it's not part of the community's lore. The amount of religious creativity in the Wiccan movement is truly admirable, but the amount of sifting and making patterns out of it, settling on customary ways of understanding and interpreting it, is slower to develop. That's what I want to have people think about. What works well in temples, covens, and personal practice, and how can we deepen? I don't want us to surrender autonomy, just to accept the need to cooperate and to collaborate and for joint ownership of what we come up with together. It's a considerable problem for a fluid, practice, and experience-based movement to develop enough cohesion to both create and pass along a consistent body of lore. As we differentiate into several sister traditions and cease to think of all denominations of the Wicca-based pagan movement as being the same thing, these consistent bodies of lore and intense spiritual experiences can grow. Now, this is a very good thing, as there is some profound, real difference hidden behind the ideological facade of the larger pagan community. Differences of approach and opinion need not be antagonistic, but they need to be acknowledged. And in my opinion, one reason why they are not is that acknowledging them requires some factual basis for them, some reason beyond personal preference, and a few judgments about what's going to be included and what's going to be excluded. Jonathan Z. Smith's Imagining a Religion begins with a really interesting chapter on taxonomy, the classification of things. And he asks whether it's useful to apply a linear, single criterion taxonomy to religion, or whether we need a polyvalent one, and coming down solidly in favor of the polyvalent and against the argument from essence. At any rate, reading it made me think about this discussion of what is Wicca, and in particular, whether I am within or outside the fold, by differing with many of my less enlightened co-religionists about some details of observance and belief. Smith argues that there's a cluster of observances and beliefs that's fairly characteristic of a given religion, but that all religions have boundaries that are fuzzy. For example, if a cluster of items A to E can be said to be Wiccan terms, typical of our religion, and a person need only have, let's say, 2 of these items to be considered Wiccan. Person A has items A and B. Person B has items B and C. Person 3 has C and D. Person 4 has D and E. Are they all part of the same religion? Person 1 has nothing in common with persons 3 and 4. In actuality, it's more complicated. since there are probably 30 or 40 items of belief and practice that are typically Wiccan, and virtually nobody holds or does all of them. But most of us would recognize that people that do a reasonable fraction of them, plus not also doing some key things from other religions, such as calling upon Jesus or Allah, as being part of the Wiccan movement. What I'm arguing around usually is not exclusion, but ranking, in considering whether someone or some ritual group is Wiccan or not, or my sort of Wicca or not. What rank should, say, skyclad working have, as compared to polytheism or being goddess primary theologically, and so on? And remember that some items contradict each other. Are Dianics, which are women only and goddess only, Wiccan? Well, they're more like Wiccan than anything else, I'd say. Sisters to the craft, at least. How about reclaiming? And so on. A rule of thumb I've used in the past, which is related to but different from the duck test. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks, it's probably a duck. If we care enough to argue about whether something is or isn't part of what we're doing, it's at least related. Some have argued that applying taxonomy to Wicca and its components is antithetical to everything that Wicca is, and further, that this is a hierarchical ranking and a tool of the patriarchy. I feel, however, that it's just a question of whether it's worthwhile to have a meaning for the word and some idea of what we're doing together. If Wicca means whatever I want it to mean, then it means nothing at all. Might as well call myself a Baptist or a small oyster if words have no meaning. If Wicca means something, then it's helpful to clarify what it is before using the term. Another part of this argument is that nobody should be able to tell exactly who is Wiccan and who is a better, older, more traditional, higher in status Wiccan. This point goes back to the question of whether the word means anything or not, if there's really something there. I don't care about status or better, particularly as someone who has at different times been defined out of Wicca myself for not being ultra-orthodox enough and not possessing the appropriate lineage papers. But I do think that words have meanings, and I also believe that there's an accumulation of cultural capital that adheres to specific meanings, processes, and so on. It's non-trivial, and it assists people to achieve their goals when they can tap into this cultural capital, or magically when they can tap into the egregore, which they can't. If Wicca, for example, means whatever I would like it to mean, and whatever you or that woman over there or my great aunt or whomever would like it to mean. The unfortunate fact is that presently the majority of people who consider themselves to be Wiccan will argue against any kind of rating or definition. They fear that they will be defined out of Wicca, and they have a strong attachment to the word, while rejecting the idea that the word has any particular meaning to it, which seems contradictory to me. They don't like being told their particular sort of Wicca is probably less consistent with the core beliefs and practices of the religion. But, in some cases that's true. Of course they won't like it. Why should they accept any standards, aside from those that benefit them personally from being imposed? Why should they have to read what someone asks them to, or do a set of exercises that someone else has chosen? What a terrible thing to believe in standards. Even worse, to evaluate where someone actually knows anything at all. I've often heard that, whatever the majority of people calling themselves Wiccan agree is Wicca. On some level, of course, this is true, at least in the broadest general terms. And since Pop identified Wicca, paganism, is fuzzy, unchallenging, and very inclusive, what's not to like? And if this were a democracy, I suppose the majority of votes will determine definitions. But this results in defining out some practices and ideas that are undoubtedly Wiccan. Because, skyclad working is not popular, and coven working is not popular, are these practices, which were the original practices of Gardner and all Wiccans for the first 20 or so years of the craft's existence, not Wiccan. Were they Wiccan when the original Gardnerian witches were doing them? If not, what religion were those guys practicing? The Baudelarization and whitewashing of the craft that has gone on is a historical argument from prudery against the one practice and from a misguided anti-hierarchic sentiment on the second case are not good arguments to continue along from those two examples. Gardner was a co-owner of a nudist camp when Wicca originated, so his take on the matter was bound to be a little bit different than the nudity equals lustfulness of the prudish. Or another favorite, it's just a man thinking with the little head. Well, since the hardcore women-only Dianic tradition of Zed Budapest practices skyclad, what's up there? Budapest is outspokenly opposed to transgender male-to-female participation in her rituals as well, so it's unlikely that the genetic sexist argument would work there. It's by no means obvious that Gardner came up with skyclad out of lust. There are real benefits to skyclad working. It genuinely is a route to a different and positive understanding of the body, the embodied mind and spirit as an expression of the material world, and nudity does not simply equal sex. Skyclad work is still quite common in coven work, but there aren't very many covens. Other things have gone in and out of style as well, but are still recognized as the cluster of ideas that distinguish Wicca from small oyster. The use of the scourge, which I've done perhaps a dozen times in my witchy career, the Great Rite, honored much more in the breach than in the breeches, but I don't think anyone can make a legitimate argument that it's not part of the Wiccan cluster of religious ideas and others. Even initiations and mystery work. Because the great majority of Wicca-identified pagans do not practice the mysteries or perform initiations, are ecstatic trance, like drawing down the moon, for example, and initiation no longer Wiccan, then what are they? The purpose of identifying the essential aspects of Wicca is not for me to lord and lady it over the uninitiated. It is helpful for teaching and learning to know what you're talking about. I will speculate that even the most white light and adamantly Unitarian Wicca 101 series doesn't include a great deal of Bible study. Just a guess on my part. And that they give the Book of Mormon a miss too, and rhythmic gymnastics, flute playing, and watching television, along with many other aspects of life and religious practice, which don't necessarily fit into Wicca. It also helps when trying to build a religious community rather than only a personal religious practice, to have a language of symbols and practices that people have in common. That way, there's a commonality and the possibility of shared experience. By doing this work, we get intellectual coherence, consistency of practice, and an accumulation of cultural capital, a foundation of basics upon which to build a more elaborate ethical and theological notions. One's understanding of the nature of the gods and their relationship to humankind produces obvious effects in one's theology. If it's Wicca is whatever anybody thinks that it is and no judgment calls can be made, then it is impossible to proceed beyond the most elementary level in any of these areas. In fact, one is condemned to the least interesting kind of practice and making one's religion completely unimportant in one's life. And for the purposes of my discussion of ritual and lore, a wide-ranging grab bag of undigested influences produces boring, uninteresting, shallow, and meaningless religious practice. The point of arguing academic religious Wicca is to proceed beyond this elementary level of theology and understanding. I'm not all that concerned with the opinions of people who prefer not to engage with ideas or to put any study or effort forward. Wicca is an elitist religion, in my opinion, and not a mass market religion. And even mass market religions have some foundation beliefs. Christianity has the Nicene Creed, minimally. If that which is called Wicca is not simply whatever anyone wants to call Wicca, the word has meaning. There appears to be a Wiccan religious movement whose adherents can generally recognize each other, with our differences in emphasis, as all belonging to. I will argue that it does exist, and that it has a historical point of origin and a time and place, and antecedents that are reasonably clear. Gardner and Associates' original coven in the area of Christchurch in southern England in the late 1940s. Although parallel developments in the occult communities in other places were happening at the same time, in particular Jack Parsons' The Witchcraft, which grew out of the OTO in California a few years before Gardner's coven, but was cut short with Parsons' accidental death, it's reasonable to begin there and say that the beliefs and practices that Gardner and company used in constructing that coven are Wiccan. Let's accept that these ideas remain Wiccan and central to any Wiccan body of lore, unless there's some good reason to say that they no longer are or never were. So those groups and individuals using these ideas and practices are Wiccan still. This original group spun off daughter groups quickly, notably when Doreen Valiente split off and formed her own group in 1957. And these daughter groups developed their own ways of doing things, keeping or discarding ideas from the original coven as they wished. Gardner had encouraged his priestesses to adapt the rituals to suit themselves from the start. So we can even claim that this rewriting and adaptability is part of the Gardnerian and Wiccan tradition if we wanted to, although that doesn't mean that whatever they came up with necessarily fits. Anyhow, rather than trying to go through the history, I'll recommend Hutton, Aidan Kelly, Margot Adler, Chaz Clifton, and others for that. There are some things that are highly likely to be Wiccan. The original beliefs and practices of the original coven. There are logical developments from those origin points. There are practices that are analogous to them, that are pretty close to them in spirit and style, and there are things that resemble them less and less. At some point, the connections become difficult to see, or the spirit of the ritual and beliefs seems so different from the original Wiccan ideas that it appears that we are speaking of two different things using the same name, separate bodies of lore. This is definitely where the movement is right now. The illusion that there is one neo-pagan Wiccan movement in which everybody's basically doing whatever the currently popular author has said has collapsed. More books have been published. The various isolated pockets and subcultures have come in contact with one another. And the revival of the original British traditions have brought that foundational material forward, as well as some genuine history to counter the origin myths and the various grandmothers. It's a point of debate where exactly something that derived from these Wiccan roots developed into something else. If one accepts that Wicca is not any group which derived in some way from Wicca, regardless of its beliefs and practices. For example, I met a pastor of the Church of the Nazarene who had been a Wiccan initiate in his youth when we were both guests on a TV show some years ago. Was his congregation now a Wiccan coven? And what about the larger denomination of the Nazarenes, which is an evangelical fundamentalist Christian denomination? I'd have to say some determination really has to be made. If my Nazarene acquaintance fits, then no problem for those who believe that. I think they're wrong. So if my Nazarene pastor does not fit, we are talking about where to draw the line, not if one can be drawn, and whether it is reasonable and useful to make these distinctions. We need to begin with the usefulness of the distinction. If we want to create a religious community, then we must have enough in common with the people that we want to be in community with that we can create something together. A common spoken language, minimally. I suggest English for my own convenience. And a minimal set of agreed beliefs and common ritual practices. If we don't want to create a religious community, no problem. So long as I'm not interfered with, people can believe whatever they want and call it whatever they want, and I really shouldn't have anything to say about the matter, although I reserve the right to be irritated. But we also can't really share anything useful, a common body of lore, to get back to the topic of this discussion. But if we want to create a religious community, we're stuck with a definitional problem that becomes more intense as we want to create a stronger and more committed community together. A body of lore begins when a group of people come together to celebrate the same thing or closely related things on the same occasions, refer to the same myths and stories, and start to do similar rituals and sing the same songs and chant the same chants. It's a natural effect of just building a community, really. And over time, things get added, often for no particular reason, and they come to be accepted by that particular community as just the way things are, and needing no explanation. An example from my own experience is the tradition of a sacred fire that a by-invitation community of people that put on Sabbat celebrations in the Vancouver area has adopted, and the tradition of the May Queen and May King and various other notions, all of which are taken very seriously by the people involved in that community and which help to define it. Another couple of examples in my experience. A number of years ago, in 1986, I hosted a pagan campout gathered on the commune where I had lived until a year or so before that. The main ritual circle had happened, and we reached the point of blessing food and drink to share. At that point, I only knew a couple of blessings of cakes and ale, and they were of the heterosexist, as the athame is to the male, so the cup is to the female, and conjoined they be one in truth form. But quite a few of the people at this event were gay men or lesbians, and I wanted something more inclusive. As I was looking at the food and drink sitting in the middle of the large field, a blessing was given to me by the gods. It is not we who bless food and drink, but it which blesses us. For in its nature it nourishes our bodies, and by sharing food and drink, we create community. This blessing has been the one I've used ever since, and it's a standard blessing of Pagans for Peace tradition, a tradition of which I am the founding high priest, and it's been picked up and used even by staunch factional opponents of ours in the neighborhood. It's become a minor part of the lore. At about the same time, or a couple of years earlier, the phrases "in the broom closet" and "coming out of the broom closet" started to be used, and they've become very widespread as well. We recognize people using these phrases as connected to the pagan community in some way, and the historical line of connection can be traced back to the originators of the blessing or the phrase. That's another interesting facet of lore, is that it indicates historical connections in a community, family resemblances, and descent. These kinds of family links are used in Gordon Melton's excellent Encyclopedia of American Religions to distinguish among the thousands of religious organizations in that country. So, why spend all this time talking about lore? Well, among other things, our rituals are part of our lore. We Wiccans are not principally the people that believe such and so, but the people that do these things on these occasions. Our communities and the different factions in them are defined by the rituals we do and how we do them. So when you think about ritual composition and performance, you really need to consider the lore that your community uses. Which authors, which mythologies, which ritual patterns, which songs and chants are likely to be familiar to the audience. By keeping inside the tradition, you make it easier for people to participate in the ritual and to derive benefit from the experiences that they have in there. And by introducing new elements, you keep them from being bored, and you also extend and develop the community's lore.